Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's fifth installment of its book talk series featuring Jan Grabowski. We're so glad you've joined us this evening. My name is Elise Herskovitz, and I'm the programs lead at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. You can feel free to keep your videos on during this webinar. We have muted your mics so we don't have any accidental interruptions. And we are recording the program this evening so we'll post it on our YouTube channel afterwards. And we welcome you to write any questions you have for Jan in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. And I'm proud to be joined this evening by Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's senior writer, Robert Sarner, who will be interviewing Jan this evening. So I'll hand it over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Elise, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us for this latest edition of FSWC's Book Talk series. I'm thrilled to have with us as our featured guest tonight, author and Holocaust scholar Jan Grabowski, who's joining us live from Ottawa, where he's based.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, Jan. We'll be discussing throughout the next hour Jan's new book, which is titled On Duty, The Role of the Polish Blue and Criminal Police in the Holocaust. We'll also be focusing on the hostility he's faced due to some people not liking what he's uncovered in his work. Later in the program, as Elise mentioned, as we always do on Book Talk, we'll be taking questions from the audience for Jan. And during our Q&A, please feel most welcome to submit your questions in the chat box. For those of you who are not familiar with Jan and his work, he has a fascinating background, both personally and academically. I have great respect for the dedication and the courage he's shown in his field of expertise. Jan is a history professor at the University of Ottawa, specializing in the Holocaust in Poland, in particular, Jewish-Polish relations during the Nazi occupation. A prolific author, he's perhaps best known for his book, Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland. In 2014, it was awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize. Since then, right-wing nationalist groups in Poland have sharply denounced Jan, accusing him of presenting, quote, a false and wrongful image of Poland and Polish people, end quote. Jan has faced harassment and even death threats due to his research. Some of his critics have even tried to have him fired from his position at the University of Ottawa. In 2017, nearly 200 historians of the Holocaust and modern European history signed an open letter defending the quality of Jan's work. They criticized the campaign against him as, quote, an attack on academic freedom and integrity. Jan was born in 1962 in Warsaw, Poland, to a Catholic mother and a Jewish father, a Holocaust survivor who fought in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. Jan graduated from the University of Warsaw, where he helped run an underground printing press for the Solidarity movement in the early 1980s. In 1988, he immigrated to Canada, and 6 years later, he received his PhD from the Université de Montréal. In 2003, Jan co-founded the Polish Center for Holocaust Research. He has given lectures and keynote presentations in many countries. Over the past 20 years, Jan has won numerous awards and academic honors for his work in Canada and abroad, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and at Yad Vashem, the International Institute for Holocaust Research in Jerusalem. So that gives you a better idea of Jan and his background. So Jan, welcome to Book Talk. And again, thank you for taking the time to be with us here
Well,
this
Robert,
evening.
thank you very much for invitation. I must tell you that I don't hear so many parts of my biography in front of all the people. So thank you very much for this thorough review of my past and here.
Well, truth be told, Jan, I could actually have gone on at much
No, no,
greater
no, no,
length.
please.
There's a lot more that, if time allowed for it, we could include. Why don't we begin with you giving the audience a brief description of your latest book, On Duty, which I should mention is published by Yad Vashem Publications, and it includes evidence that you uncovered, which has never been made public before.
Well, in a short, let's say, a short summary, Polish Blue Police is one of these forces or organizations which basically flew under the radar for variety of reasons. Which, if you look at a force of 20,000, mostly Polish pre-war policemen who were drafted into service by the Germans once they occupied Poland. You are talking about a force which has been responsible for a number of extraordinary horrors. And the fact that there was not even one book before my book has been published, not even one book, not even one article about the involvement of this force in the fate of Polish Jews, I found absolutely astounding and astonishing, rather, given the fact that one of the most best known Jewish Polish historians, Emanuel Ringelblum, who died, was detected while in hiding in March 1944. In his last book, written in hiding, he wrote that. Polish Blue Police has on its hands blood of hundreds of thousands of Jews. Now, this is actually not an exaggeration. So if you look at this issue, it's a huge problem. It's an untackled part of history. So my book basically looks chronologically at the involvement of these pre-war Polish officers who found themselves working now for a new master and transforming themselves into a very efficient, as I found out, killing machine of the Jews, acting sometimes on the orders of the Germans and sometimes acting or using their agency and actually murdering the Jews without any knowledge being shared with the Germans. So I track the involvement in this book on basing on loads of documents from dozens of archives from Poland, from Israel, from the States, from Germany. I track this elusive, let's say, force, and I describe chronologically the involvement from 1939 until 1945 in what has been a tragic role in the history and the fate of Polish Jewry.
And a bit later, we're going to get more into actually what your book documents in terms of the activities of the Polish police during the Holocaust. Now, Poland, which of course is close to home for you, wasn't just another country occupied by the Nazis. At the outbreak of World War II, as you know so well, it was home to the largest Jewish population in Europe. And 6 years later, by the end of the war, with of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, nearly half of them were Polish.
Yeah, and I mean, it has to be also repeated again and again that survival rate for Polish Jews was absolutely dismal. I mean, we know that about 280,000 survived, but out of them, 250 fled to the Soviet Union. So when you look at Jews who actually found themselves under the German occupation, we historians say that about 30,000 survived to see liberation. Now, if out of 3 million, so it's 99% fatality rate, which makes Poland one of the most complete and most horrifying, efficient genocides imaginable.
Given how much research you have done throughout your career about what happened in Poland to the Jews and the complicity of non-Jews in the mass murder of Polish Jews. What prompted you to do this latest book now?
Well, it's actually a result of good, I would say, 15 years of work. It has been accumulated, but basically, whenever you study the history of the Holocaust in Poland, you encounter the blue police in a variety of situations. So they come to the surface time and time and time again in practically in all Jewish testimonies from General Gouvernement or this part of Poland, which Germans called general government, where vast majority of Polish Jews dwelled. So it's inevitable that practically in each and every Jewish testimony you will find traces and tracks of these so-called officers in blue. So I basically the evidence was piling up. And at certain point, as a historian, you decide that there is always more things to come. There is more archival, let's say, evidence to come. But at certain point, you arrive at this destination that you know more or less what has really happened. And that's when a historian, let's say, starts writing. So once you arrive at this level of knowledge where you can safely say that more or less, I know what has happened. And of course, there are areas which will be later on can be studied, let's say, further. But this moment, let's say, I reached about 6 or 7 years ago when I started writing. The book was published in Polish, the Polish edition in 2020, right before the pandemic began. So it was a long process. And actually, the variety, this great number of archives I had to look at was also related to the fact that during the war and definitely after the war, the Polish blue police started to destroy its own records. So basically, in order to rebuild, to paint this picture, you need to look at evidence in various other institutions, organizations, and people who came in touch with the blue police. So hence this variety of different archives I had to put to use. So this is basically the fruit of long labor, which I think brings a lot of new evidence to the to our knowledge, basically.
While researching for the book over the course of many years, much of it done in Poland, did anything surprise you?
Yes, it is. It is actually, it's very strange when a historian who knows more or less the history of a chosen period becomes surprised. Now, what I was really surprised at was the level of complicity of these Polish blue officers and their ability to create actually a system which ran parallel, a system of terror, which ran parallel to German system of terror, and then their extraordinary ability, let's say, to detect the Jews, their agency. This was something that I was not aware of the extent of it. That's for certain. And the second part is the so-called Polish criminal police, which I devoted a lot of time to. There is one section of my book is devoted to blue police, and one long chapter is devoted to Polish criminal police, which was the plainclothes agents, which was absolutely deadly. Those are pre-war detectives with their own networks of agents operating throughout Poland. So the level of complicity, the level also of independent work were the things that sort of shocked me when I started to add up these things. And the book is actually looking at 100 police stations across Polish countryside and Polish cities.
You mentioned, Jan, that some of the relevant archives had been destroyed that you would have wanted to have obviously consulted in your research. What were some of the other challenges that you had to deal with? Did you encounter much resistance, even hostility, in trying to uncover what you were focusing on? And I guess this leads to a related question. Here we are 80 years since the end of the Holocaust. How sensitive today is the topic of your book in Poland.
It is actually surprising because if you look at the level of at the heat of debates, at the tempers raised, at emotions stirred, it's actually the further we are removed chronologically from the event itself, the more actually there is the debates are becoming, let's say, more and more hot, and the emotions run higher. Now, in Poland, it's related to several issues, but one of them is a massive involvement of Polish state institutions in let's say, manipulating history to defend something that in Poland is called the good name of the nation. And to be honest, I don't think in any other Western nation there is anything comparable to the state apparatus created in Poland in order to, let's say, gain control of the historical narrative. And the Holocaust is one of the essential battlegrounds between independent historians and state agents. We are talking about actually one institution only, like the Institute of National Remembrance, which has now a budget of 200 million Canadian dollars, and this buys a lot more than in Canada, employing 3,500 people, 300 of them with PhDs, and they are basically producing historiography. So this is one part. There are many other issues actually, but the to gain control of the narrative of the Holocaust has been a constant part of so-called Polish history policy. So whenever a book like mine or any number of books written by, let's say, independent Polish historians arrive at the market, they are met with extraordinary opposition, which is directed by the organs of the state. 6 years ago, or at this stage, 7 years ago, I was co-editor and co-author of a massive study, 2 volumes, and the shorter version has been published in English, A Night Without End by Indiana University Press. And this publication of this book, which demonstrated the level, also the level of, let's say, hostility of so-called Polish bystanders to the Jews. The state-sponsored attack was nothing short of vicious. It was still when the nationalists were in power, but I can tell you, so history is very much alive in a variety of ways, which we as historians are not prepared to confront. No one teaches actually us during our PhD program how to deal with state-inspired hate. But so this is part of this scenario where history becomes a battleground. And we have these things, or we had also these things in Canada, but the scale of this state involvement was definitely different. So yes, there was hostility, there was a lot of it, but actually the book made it. The book is available, and my role as a historian is actually to deliver the goods, and what happens later, it's up to my readers.
Well, we certainly see that in Poland, history is clearly a very charged subject, particularly when it comes to the Holocaust. Relating to this, Jan, so many of our audience, I'm sure, will remember, it's not that long ago, that in 2018, I believe it was, the Polish government passed a law, very highly controversial law, that outlawed, if I understood it correctly, any mention of Polish responsibility for and complicity in the Nazi crimes. And I'm wondering, did this law affect your work on the book and your inclination to go forward with the book?
It didn't. Actually, in my case, where I am based in Ottawa. I spend a lot of time, of course, in Poland, but this had study of the Holocaust involves a certain higher degree of responsibility of well, one has to remember that there are millions of dead people, of innocent dead people, whose memory needs to be preserved. So it sort of imposes upon one a certain responsibility, which makes the threats less relevant. However, all this being said, I have to say that Polish government's legal, let's say, machete deployed in 2018 has had its very, very bad impact because in my case, of course, it didn't matter much because I was already, let's say, as I mentioned, based in Canada, outside of the reach for the most part of Polish authorities. But how many PhDs will never or have not been written on the topics which should be addressed? How many students went in different directions? Especially if you are in Poland, well, you are in this fragile situation that you are dependent on government funding for your research. If you're a student, PhD student, and so on. So here, the authorities probably gained a lot of ground simply introducing something called freezing atmosphere or freezing climate. And this freezing climate was very visible throughout the nationalistic period between 2015 and last year. And now there is a democratic turnover. So now we have a different regime, a democratic one in Poland. I'm still not convinced that in the area of memorial struggles it will have much impact. But one thing is certain: the historians like myself are no longer looking for to prison terms, let's say, or something that has been in my case very important was government-sponsored civil action. Civil action is quite dangerous because it does not give you a victim status. It can bankrupt you, and of course it can detract you from your work. So I was involved in a very long trial, being sued by a so-called GONGO, which means government organized NGO, funded also by the government, and it was a long, very tedious and painful process, which I had to endure. And the stakes were high because actually, when I lost in the first instance, the Polish court decided that anyone who writes anything about Polish complicity with the Germans and in the Holocaust should be legally responsible and punished. So this verdict was overturned on appeal, but it was a close situation. It was a really dangerous situation for all historians, independent historians working in Poland and outside of Poland too, whenever they dealt with Polish history. So stakes were high, and nowadays the situation is much more calm, but this memorial warfare is quite visible still, and we are now approaching the 80th anniversary in a few days, the 20th and 80th anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz, and I can assure you that there will be fireworks again.
Let's turn now, Jan, to actually the central focus of your book, which, of course, are the actions of the Polish police vis-a-vis the Jewish population in Poland during the war. My first question about that is how much did the police and their actions depend on assistance from the public for the police to carry out what they did?
Look, the thing is that German presence in Poland was in a way limited. I mean, Germans had other preoccupations, and wherever possible, they delegated authority to different local institutions, organizations, and people. It happened in France, it happened in Netherlands, happened in Poland. Now, in this case, German presence in rural areas was really thin. So the more distant were the Germans, the greater was the role in enforcing the occupation, let's say, regulations, enforcing the rules imposed by the Germans, delegated to Polish police. And then Polish police turned around and delegated authority to, as I write extensively about it, Polish voluntary firefighting brigades. And then there were the masses of people who were one way or another involved in creating, I would call it creating an invisible wall around, for instance, the ghettos. What we tend to forget very often is that 75% of Polish Jews who found themselves in the ghettos by 1941, 4041. Actually, they lived in so-called open ghettos. There were no walls. I mean, that you usually associate with ghetto, they have been in Warsaw, in Krakow, in Łódź, and that's it. Otherwise, you have flimsy fence, you have barbed wire, but the real border is the mental one. Is the Jews fleeing the ghettos encountered a very hostile, usually a very hostile world, and this hostile world was something that I describe in my book. How this invisible but very firm and solid wall surrounding the open ghettos was maintained by segments of local Polish population, and it was, of course, related to the presence of omnipresent blue police. They were in small villages even, so they penetrated very profoundly. And also, what is forgotten often, that Polish blue police was given instructions by an authority by the Germans to supervise the Jewish police. So very often one forgets it, that immediate supervisors of the Jewish police in the ghettos were the Polish blue officers.
Did the Polish police, during the Nazi occupation of the country, did they do what they did for fear of punishment if they didn't enact what they were doing? In other words,
Well,
how fearful were they of punishment by the Germans? And they could, I don't know, hide behind that excuse, saying, well, we had to do what we did or face severe punishment from the Germans.
Well, the thing is that my older, very esteemed colleague, Christopher Browning, wrote an absolutely wonderful book 25 years ago, Ordinary Men. He was looking at German reserve policemen, and he found out in his study that German reserve policemen who were responsible for mass executions of tens of thousands of Jews could simply refuse orders to shoot. And nothing happened. The problem was that there were always enough volunteers to let's say replace the very few individuals among the German reserve policemen who refused to follow orders. And I found exactly the same pattern and I describe it in the book, that actually the participation in execution squads, participation in execution of Jews was of course, ordered by the Germans, but you could say no, and nothing happened. And usually, as I found out, there were enough volunteers to take part in this story. Now, the second part, which is much more, let's say, hidden, is the fact that the Polish policemen in blue uniforms actually created a system of hunting down the Jews on their own, which ran parallel to what the Germans actually imposed and created. And this was a different story when the Polish blue police simply became hunters on their own after 1942, for reasons which I describe in the book, greed, of course, being the primary motive, but not only. It's in some cases, in very many actually cases, Polish rural population, and Poland was very much a rural country, and they actually addressed or came to the blue police to solve their Jewish problem, and as they called it, and the blue police solved this problem in a way which, of course, you can imagine. So this kind of involvement is omnipresent from north to south and from east to west.
Before I get to the next question, I just want to remind our audience to please feel most welcome to pose any questions in our chat box, which we'll get to later and share those questions with Jan. My next question, Jan, is did any of the police implicated in the persecution of Jews during the Holocaust, did they face any consequences after the war for what they did?
So the question is that some did. Now, some did, and what was actually intriguing and interesting, after the war, there was a wave of retribution, let's say. People who were accused or suspected of collaborating with the Germans had to face Polish courts. There were tens of thousands of these trials, which were held between 1945 and 1950, more or less. That's the majority of them. Now, what I found interesting is that there was not a large number. I mean, basically, as blue policemen who faced really justice were the ones who struck Polish population, ethnic Poles. Now, if they limited themselves to hurting Jews, they were quite unlikely to face justice after the war. So, in majority of cases, when blue policemen faced justice and were actually sentenced, they hurt in a variety of ways, including murder. The ethnic Poles. And then the proceedings were really swift and pretty serious. In the cases of policemen who were responsible for Jewish deaths, it was of little, let's say, value because there were no witnesses left. I mean, if you look at 1947, the chances of finding Jews who would like to testify, who would be alive in Poland and willing to testify against Poles in Polish courts were very slim. So, and as I mentioned, the Holocaust was so thorough that 1% survived. So the chances actually were, as in a case of that you would go unpunished, and especially interesting was the case of Polish criminal police. These plainclothes detectives, practically all of them that I write about were involved in a different ways in tracking down the Jews, and none of them actually were faced justice after the war. So as long as you remained committed to, let's say, to fight on so-called Jewish front, you were quite unlikely to feel the wrath of justice after the war.
Right, sobering. I want to turn now, Jan, to something that you write on page 427, to be precise, toward the end of the book. And I'm going to read it and then ask you something. And this is what you write. There is a question that troubles historians researching the history of genocides. Not only Holocaust historians, but also scholars who study the Armenian genocide or that of the Tutsi in Rwanda. The question is simple. Why and how do seemingly normal people turn into mass murderers? Looking through tens of thousands of pages of archival documents, listening to recorded accounts, talking to survivors, and reading books and articles on the subject, one would hope to come closer to finding an answer to the question that has been bothering so many scholars of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, despite the mounting weight of evidence, the goal grows more elusive. So that says something, especially coming from a Holocaust historian like yourself, who has studied this dark chapter for decades. So my question is, given the focus of your work, which, to put it mildly, is highly sobering, do you ever get depressed from what you're studying?
I mean, this is a question that we Holocaust scholars have to deal on daily basis, and it this exposure to this massive suffering of absolutely innocent people tends to shape you in a way. So for instance, you start to put the question motivations of people and about human nature. So there is each one has to find his or her way out of this predicament. But obviously, yes, this exposure to this absolutely horrifying mountain of human agony and suffering is not only sobering, it's sort of covers you with this deep, I would say, sadness, which is a part of this work. But it's not to say that other scholars are free of this kind of. I was reading some accounts of Japanese occupation of China in late 1930s and in the early 1940s. And I learned that some scholars of that particular issue also had these problems. So yes, it's a universal problem that you are putting, let's say, to question our human motivations. And the fact, as you mentioned, you read this part. It's one of my constant problems is simply to find this answer why these things happen. And why, when I was looking at this Polish blue police, we are talking about pre-war cops who were regulating traffic, right? People who were, giving you fine if your bicycle was not properly, let's say, lit. You're basically your neighbors too. And when I see this process of transformation of thousands of them within a period of 1 to 2 years, they move from, let's say, from regular policemen, people who are to defend the public order, and they move through robbery to murder in a swift progression. The thing that sticks out and comes out is the word starting with A, of course, anti-Semitism. There is this thing that certain people become less and less human, and of course I'm referring to Jews, and the ground has been prepared over decades or centuries that this particular group of people was not, let's say, that violence against them was something legitimate, and it was quite horrible.
I'm going to turn now to another passage from your book, Jan. In chapter 8, you focus on the subject of the rescuing of Jews by non-Jews, or more to the point, the lack thereof, and how this subject has undergone a sort of rewriting of history in Poland in recent years. And you say in the book that, and I know you referred earlier to the 20,000 Polish police during the war, but in the book you say, if I recall correctly, that of those 20,000, only 15 were later awarded the Righteous Among the Nations honor, which of course is given to non-Jews for saving Jews. And on page 400, you write, and I quote, "The attempts so frequent today to describe the heroism of people rescuing Jews as something obvious in Polish society not only falsifies the history of the Holocaust, but also diminishes the extraordinary deeds and courage of people who were prepared not just to make a stand against the German extermination policy, but above all, to face the hostility of their own neighbors, for whom rescuing Jews was unacceptable and an act of betrayal of the strangely defined concept of national community." Unquote. So, as someone who just returned a few days ago from Poland, I'm interested, do you see any changes in the attitude of the public in Poland vis-a-vis this subject?
Actually, I call this thing this process of twisting historical narrative. I call it righteous defense. And in Poland, it has been let's say, developed since 1946, since the Kielce pogrom. But in the 21st century, it acquired a life of its own. Basically, the attempt is being constantly made to present righteous among the nations, Poles were awarded this honor as basically the default position of the Polish society, that saving or helping the Jews was something natural, widespread, and this, of course, flies in the face of the massive evidence that we have. So today, if you go to Poland, you will find, and if you visit, even if you visit the website of Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will find this extraordinary stress on the noble deeds of Poles during the war, and this is a part of this inability in Eastern Europe generally, and especially in the epicenter of Holocaust, which was Poland, to come to terms with the simple fact that Jews were dying alone. The Jews were dying alone, and the help which was meager, is very rare, and individuals who engaged in helping the Jews were absolutely extraordinary and exceptional people who were mostly afraid of their own neighbors. I mean, the Germans really were on the horizon. They created a system, but the greatest fear associated with rescuing the Jews was, of course, your neighbors, sometimes even your family in certain cases. So this thing is largely forgotten. And nowadays, if you look at different celebrations. For instance, at the end of March, there is a day to commemorate National Day of Commemoration of Poles saving Jews. And monuments are being unveiled. I mean, one of the most outrageous ones has been unveiled 3 years ago in Treblinka. I mean, this is a place where you should not stress Polish virtues, but Jewish death, commemorate the tragedy, and there you have this kind of outrageous monument built without a shred of evidence, actually, to honor a Pole who allegedly helped the Jews at Treblinka station. So these attempts are being done repeatedly and constantly, and this is something that that triggers my very, I would say, negative reaction. So unfortunately, this righteous defense has been continued by the Polish state under democratic regimes and under autocratic regimes. It's a constant, and actually it's something that unifies Polish political scene from left to the right. This kind of, we call it Holocaust distortion.
Before we get to questions from our audience, I notice there are several already in the chat box. I just want to ask you, Jan, who are you hoping will read this book, and what are you hoping they'll take away from it?
Well, this is actually a difficult question. You never know your readers. I mean, the thing is that I wrote this book with a general audience in mind. This is something that should interest people who not only are interested in the history of World War II or history of the Holocaust, but especially as you read the passage in the history of human morality too. So this book is addressed beyond. I especially wrote it not in a, let's say, hermetic language, but rather open language in order to attract a fairly broad audience. I know in Poland it sold well. It had fairly good reviews. It was nominated for one of the most important prizes even. But did it change the way people think in Poland? No, it did not about the past. However, if I can leave, this book and hope that at least some people will perhaps understand that the crucial point I raise is that Holocaust was a German deed and a German project. However, it was also a project which involved practically each and every European society. And this is the contribution of this book, is to show a particular, in the Polish context, a very important and influential group of people who, in a way, joined a German genocidal project and carried it on their own terms.
We're going to turn now, Jan, to some questions we have in the chat box, which I'm just going to look at. The first one here is from Jane Knuth, who asks, how similar are Poland and Austria with regard to collaborating with the Nazis, and then wanting only to remember the invasion and this victim theory?
Well, the problem here is Austria, in a sense, the famous saying is that the greatest success of Austrian diplomacy was to convince everybody that Hitler was a German and so on and so forth. So the comparison is difficult here because one has to remember that Polish society was that the level of terror against Polish, and I'm speaking about ethnic Polish society, was extraordinary. So Poles found themselves at the receiving end of an absolutely horrifying terror machine of German state and German institutions. The thing is that Polish society was victimized, was a victim of war. Millions of Poles, close to 2 million Poles, were also murdered and lost their lives during the war. So the thing is that one cannot even compare here the situation in Austria, which basically, well, by the way, the majority of SS apparatus in Poland was actually built around Austrian officers from Austria. But the problem in Poland is that if you have the involvement of Poles in the Holocaust is something quite extraordinary because there was no political project made by the Germans and offered to the Poles. Now, let's say, in Ukraine, in Lithuania, in Latvia, people who collaborated with the Germans had this excuse. Look, they will eventually bring us independence. There was this excuse. In Poland, their Germans never promised anything like it. Quite to the contrary. So the Polish situation is even more complex because people who somehow joined the German genocidal project did it without any, let's say, political encouragement from the German point of view. They were pursuing their own ends in their own goals. And furthermore, in a Polish context, it's extraordinarily difficult to ask a society raised with its own victim status to recognize that segments of Polish society were also involved in this greatest crime, one of the greatest crimes, or the greatest crime in human history, in European history, in any case. So this is what makes these comparisons so deadly difficult, or I would say even impossible.
Morley Katz writes, very interesting and disturbing, but unfortunately not surprising. He asked, do you see any parallels here with Goldhagen's analysis and observations about ordinary Germans in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners?
Right. Well, Goldhagen's thesis the book is actually very interesting, but it raised a lot of ire among historians. Basically, what Goldhagen argued is that Germans developed something that he called eliminationist anti-Semitism. In other words, they were born and raised in an atmosphere of this extraordinary violent anti-Semitism, which resulted in the Holocaust. Well, this actually was something that historians like myself do not agree, because for one simple reason, when you look at non-German populations, if you look at Romania, if you look even in Poland, as I do this thing, you can find overwhelming evidence of massive violence perpetrated by non-Germans. So this eliminationist anti-Semitism was definitely not limited to Germany. It was rather present elsewhere. So I would say that the Goldhagen's thesis did not explain the situation well enough. But definitely where I agree with Goldhagen is that anti-Semitism in various forms was this propelling force that made this German genocidal project indeed a pan-European operation.
Agnes Klein asks, what was the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in creating the mentality behind the actions of the Polish police that you write about in the book?
Well, the thing is that Polish church was before the war, and there is no discussion about it. Before the war was very profoundly and deeply anti-Semitic. I mean, if you look at Polish Catholic press, you don't have to look any further. Now, the problem with the actions of the Catholic Church in Poland is that the church archives are still closed. So they are private archives, and despite, for instance, my numerous attempts to get hold or to simply to be allowed access. I was always denied access. And the only people who are allowed to use church archives are actually people, historians engaged in hagiographic writings, church writings. So there is a lot of evidence which we don't have access to. But if you look, to give you an example, of course, the blue policemen were people, were Catholics, good Catholics, 99% of them. They went to church and they listened to their preachers. Now, what they listened to, we can gather from Jewish testimonies. For instance, I call it fear of Sunday. Jews in hiding were especially fearful of Sunday. Why? Because their hosts, saving hosts who hid them actually, came back very upset, very often very upset from the church after hearing a sermon in which, they were informed who the Jews are and what should be done and should not be done with them. Another part of the calendar which was most deadly for Jews was of course Easter. All the Catholic celebrations around it. So, on the other hand, what you have in Poland is absolute silence of hierarchy. The only letter, the only piece of the document related to the Holocaust emanating from the Polish Catholic Church during the Holocaust was a letter sent by Polish Archbishop of Krakow, Sapiecha, to Hans Frank, the governor, on November 3rd, if I recall well, 1942, where he protested the use of Polish youth in liquidations of the ghettos because the Germans are giving Polish young men vodka, and this is demoralizing for the Polish youth. So it gives you an idea. But on the ground, there were individual priests who actually were engaged in rescuing the Jews. Of course, we are talking about a huge apparatus, but by and large, Polish Catholic Church was deeply anti-Semitic, and of course, it carried through the war.
David Stambler asked a question. He says, and perhaps you saw the results of a major survey on global anti-Semitism by the ATL, the Anti-Defamation League, that was published yesterday. I'm not sure if you saw it, in which the survey documents, based on their survey results, the percentage of anti-Semitism or anti-Semites in more than 100 countries, I believe.
I haven't seen it, no.
Yeah, but David Stambler asked you, the question is, what is your opinion on the percentage of Poles who today still hold anti-Semitic views?
Okay, well, in Poland, there are no Jews, okay? For demographic purposes, the Jewish community has been annihilated. There are a few thousand people who self-identify as Jews, but in terms of a 38 million strong society, Jews do not exist. To have anti-Semitism without the Jews is a phenomenon, of course, which we know of and which can be best studied in Poland. So to give you an idea, back in 2021, so 4 years ago, a large study has been undertaken by two sociologists on a very representative number of people, and they found out that 45% of Poles agreed with the statement that Jews hold too much power in the world, and 20%, 19, 20, every fifth Pole declared that World War II was a horrible thing, but it's good that because of it, we don't have so many Jews today in Poland. So if you have every 20% of people in a place where Holocaust physically happened. And one has to remember that on Polish pre-war territory, 4.7 out of 6 million Jews were put to death. So if in Poland you have today 19% of people who think that it was a good thing that what happened, that we don't have so many Jews today, it gives you an idea of the depth of the problem.
Doris Epstein writes, Poland is whitewashing the Holocaust, and presumably also its role in the Holocaust. She asked, do young people buy that?
They buy it and they like it, yes. And this is the problem why this so-called Polish history policy is so successful, because basically it sells a product that everyone wants to eat. So there is one more statistic, let's say a poll, which has been done constantly over the last 30 years, since 1992 to be precise. Every 5 years, teams of sociologists asked Poles same questions. And one of these questions was, do you think that Polish nation suffered more, less, more, or the same as the Jews during the war? Now, imagine 1992, vast majority of Poles said that the Jews suffered more. Today, in 2021, the response is that 71% of Poles, and the exact number, 71% of Poles believe that Poles suffered equally or more than the Jews during the war. So if you have this situation, it means that this kind of historical fallacies do have an impact, and you can see this curve on the period of last 3 decades.
Because of time, we unfortunately won't have the possibility of taking more questions from the audience. And before we conclude, I just want to ask one last question in connection with something you said earlier. You mentioned about the upcoming commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I believe you said you expect there'll be, I think you said fireworks. And I just want to follow up on that and ask what you're referring to.
Well, the thing is that if you look at what happens at Auschwitz, Auschwitz has become now the focal point, of course, and you have delegations, you have diplomats. The thing is that in Poland, you have a very successful attempt to present Auschwitz as a center of Polish suffering. In Poland nowadays, one more thing, more than 50% of people make an association, primary association, that Auschwitz is the center of Polish national suffering. Now, the thing is that what Polish also Auschwitz Museum did, and what is being done constantly, is the confusion of two things: a commemoration of Auschwitz I, which is concentration camp where the Poles died by tens of thousands, with Auschwitz II, which is Birkenau, which is the extermination camp 3 kilometers distant, where 1.2 million Jews have been put to death. So these two camps are now blended into one, and common human suffering is the name of the new, let's say, narrative. And I expect very much this kind of narrative to be, let's say, presented during next couple of weeks. So our common suffering, Jews are included, of course, at par with the Polish suffering. So this will be probably a point of discord if you let people to voice their opinions openly.
And with that, we must conclude for the reasons of time, and this does bring us to the end of this most recent segment of FSWC's Book Talk series. I want to thank everyone for joining us here this evening, with special appreciation, of course, to Jan for being our featured guest. For anyone interested in purchasing On Duty, it's available for order from the Yad Vashem website. And Jan has told me that he's expecting very soon it will also become available on Amazon.
I was promised that it should be before the end of the month. And let me just thank you for this kind invitation, and to all of our listeners for tuning in. I appreciate very much your attention and your time.
Thank you, Jan. And it's really been most engaging. And we hope that our audience will be able to join us for our next segment in our Book Talk series. If you have suggestions for future editions of Book Talk, or you have suggestions of writers or other books that you think would be of interest to our community, please do send us your ideas. Now, on behalf of Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I want to thank all of you again for being with us here now, and good night, and thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jan.
Bye-bye.